Welcome to another episode of Come Together. Okay, I guess we're live.
There it is. Yeah. Yes, yes, yes.
David Garrow, how are you? Thanks so much for
Good.
coming. Thanks so much for joining me today. How are you?
Sorry we had to got delayed a little bit.
No problem. Totally fine. I got a chance to take my kids to the science museum and let my
Oh,
wife have a couple of minutes to herself. Yeah, they had a great time. This place is awesome. It's in Fort Lauderdale and they've got these awesome exhibits, world records, flight simulators, hurricane simulators explaining how the weather changes and animals, baby crocodiles and stuff like that. It's real cool. My kids have a great time. I have a great time. Yes, I'm so excited to talk to you. You, sir, are a historian about the time period that I think is by probably the most interesting time period in American history, to pretty much present day, right? I mean, your last book was about Obama, so till about 20. When did you read the book after his presidency or leading into it?
it came out in Rising Star came out in 2017.
Gotcha, gotcha. Okay. And since then, you've been what have you been up to?
Pretty much all the writing I do nowadays for the
Mm.
last 5 or 6 years is all book reviewing, either for the Wall Street Journal or for the Washington Free Beacon.
Mm,
I still
okay.
do an I still do an awful lot of like manuscript reviewing for university presses, Oxford, Cambridge, Princeton, Yale. Sometimes I feel I'm working for Oxford University Press.
I hear. I hear. And what are they looking for from you? What kind of feedback are they looking from you about accuracy of detail, quality? What are they looking for?
Yeah, the whole gamut. I mean, some of it is full book manuscripts. Some of
Mhm.
it is proposals for book projects. I've never been a fan of proposals. Go ahead and get it done. Don't talk about you know potentially doing it. Do it. OUP has this set of bibliography publications, which I don't fully understand, and they send me, and they pretty much have me read all the civil rights movement ones.
Wow, gotcha. So you're constantly engaged in this material,
Yeah, I know. I have a books I need to read pile downstairs that has 9 or 10 in it.
man. And how, it's crazy. I have my pile is generally 3 or 4 at a time before I really let myself add more to it. But do you go back and forth between books, or you have to focus on one at a time when you're going, or do you pick them up and down?
With books that I'm not that I don't have to review. I'll stop in the middle of those when I've got something that is actual work. I mean, like now I've got 2 forthcoming books from the Wall Street Journal. I've done one. I'm about past halfway in the other. We don't have, you know, with book reviewing, they send you what are called galleys, which are unfinished.
Mhm.
They're preprint paperback, and you can't. Sometimes things change between the galley and the finished book. Both of these 2 books have all sorts of factual errors in them, and I'm not gonna be able to write anything until we see the finished books to see whether things got cleaned up. The odds are that they haven't gotten cleaned up. When you I generally, especially with the wonderful folks at Free Beacon, I try very hard to review only books that I can be really enthusiastic about because it's not fun to have to
Mhm.
you saying, this book is thoroughly unreliable. I can
Right.
give you a quick notorious example. One of these
Sure.
books says that John F. Kennedy, well-known figure, needless to say, that John F. Kennedy voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Well, wrong. If you go look at the Senate vote record, Kennedy, of course, voted in favor of civil rights. Eh, yeah, and
So where's the premise for that? Why was that just made up out of where is that pulled out of?
well, if you look, this I'm afraid is yet one more indication of damage that AI is doing. If you web search, John F. Kennedy Civil Rights Act of 1957, the first thing that AI brings up at the top of the page is a completely erroneous, I think, 2014 story from a small Boston newspaper saying he voted against it. Now, if you scroll down to like the sixth item, you actually get the actual said vote total. So, don't, A, don't believe everything you see on the web, and B, certainly don't believe the first thing that's at the top of the page.
Yeah, certainly. Well, there's several reasons aside from the fact that that may be AI and it might be wrong and hallucinating. Also, I think the first 3 or 4 results of every search are generally ads. So, I know that because I sell medical equipment and, I was working on getting on the top of Google search for years. And then at a certain point, I realized I'm really competing for the 4th or 5th spot. And how many people, if you're going to shop online, how often do you get to 6 websites before you buy something? Almost never. So, I was like, I'm wasting my time on this, but the truth is that that's a very unfortunate reality that we don't really like to do our homework. Our brains look for shortcuts, and we like to find the quickest information as soon as possible, and to hell whether it's accurate or not.
Yeah. No, and it's a real problem with, nonfiction history books because once an error gets into print, you know, people rely upon something they
Mhm.
think is reliable and no, it got it wrong.
Uh-huh.
Uh, I mean,
Sure.
weirdly, both of the 2 books that I've got to deal with, they both make the same exact factual error. One that is clearly pointed out in Jonathan Ives' Pulitzer Prize winning King biography, 2, 3 years ago. It involves, did the well known black singer Mahalia Jackson sitting near King during the March on Washington, his I Have a Dream speech, did Miss Jackson call out the king, tell them about your dream, Martin? Now, I reviewed every pristine recording. It's not there. Didn't have, but
Oh, man.
once it gets out there, it's like chasing down insects or something.
Yeah.
Some of them still get through.
Yeah. I was actually I was gonna wait till a little bit further in, but now that we're basically talking about this, I'm curious what your perception is on interpreting history or relaying history, and like how those lines get blurred. Because I've spoken to a lot of authors from, on the show, the last couple of years, and there have been some people who have been genuinely blown away with the amount of, knowledge and detailed information they have in their head. And there are plenty of people I'm like, "I can't believe I even read your stupid book. This is like, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my entire life." And it's just because, like you said, it is in print, A, kind of gives it a kind of weight that it may not deserve, but B, I'm curious how much of this is interpretation, people taking creative liberties, how much of it history in general is interpretation as opposed to just the record?
One of my favorite humorous stories of a fellow civil rights scholar, Charles Payne, 30 years ago, in a very nice sort of historiographical essay at the back of his superb book on Mississippi, I've Got the Light of Freedom. He's got a paragraph comparing me with someone else, and he says, Dave, this is almost an exact quote. Dave Garrow is
Hey everyone, real quick, if you're enjoying the show, click subscribe and rate the show 5 stars. Helps a ton. Thanks so much.
Sergeant Joe Friday of civil rights history, which is a reference to an old TV show from the 1960s. Just the facts, man. And I take that as a compliment. One of the dangers we've seen in civil rights historiography, and I've interviewed, between all of my books, I've probably done formal interviews with close to 2,000 people over the course of
Wow.
45 plus years. So I deeply believe in interviewing participants, but human memory can be wrong. Human memory
It often is.
create, and people, it's not that people are lying to you, it's
That's right.
people come to believe a version that they've told themselves. And so one has to be very careful, very critical about stories that are, really are too good to be true. And so I'm pretty firm about having a, good, poo-poo detector, to avoid the four-letter word there. But some folks, particularly people who don't come out of either a good academic training or good newspaper training. I've got multiple friends who write important books who all once were reporters at the Wall Street Journal. They don't make
Mhm.
mistakes. They were brought up the right way. We get some people, this is more of a problem in Britain, frankly, than the US, people who end up writing nonfiction books. And, you know, if it's a great story, they go with the great story, period.
Mhm.
And they're not looking over their shoulder. Give another quick example. J. Edgar Hoover, FBI
Mhm.
director, from the
Sure.
1920s to the early 1970s. There is this popular belief out there in the world that Hoover not only was gay, but was a cross-dresser.
I was about to say that.
That's a complete crock. It's entirely false. I don't think Hoover had, and I back 45 years ago interviewed a number of his deputies,
Mhm.
who knew him quite well, and a very good historian, Athan Theoharis, now deceased. Athan wrote a great little book. It's got to be 15, 18 years ago, completely disproving that this notion that Hoover was a cross-dresser. But has that tamped down? Not at all.
No, sir.
So
It's too much fun, you know? It's because people wanna believe it, I guess.
I and then and we don't want to start that down this rabbit trail. Assassination conspiracy. I mean, there is, it is 100% true that James Earl Ray killed Martin Luther King, that Lee Harvey Oswald killed President Kennedy. But, people, a significant percentage of people don't want to believe that inconsequential losers can end up playing humongously tragic uh,
Sure. Roles.
historical role. They
Yes, sure.
need some grand conspiracy, the CIA, whatever. Part of that, the problem with that worldview is that people again and again overemphasize the competence of the deep state, of intelligence agencies. I have very extensive experience with the FBI and a fair amount of experience with the CIA. Oftentimes, what they're telling themselves is complete dog poo. You know, they're believing something someone tells them, and it's completely imagined. And with the FBI, when they were like wiretapping someone, they were competent at that. They can correctly transcribe a recording,
Sure.
and it's great at collecting newspaper articles. But when you're dealing with human informants, the level of inaccuracy, where somebody's telling their control agent, so and so told me that so and so told them,
Sure.
the inaccuracy rate goes up hugely.
Right. You know what? It's very interesting because I totally hear that actually. I think it's very I think that's cool. What I would say, and I'm not saying this to make an argument for the J. Edgar Hoover situation, but what I would say, is listen, I know that there's a lot of people that have a lot of aspects to their lives that are often not documented in general, and you might have a quote unquote hearsay moment where someone that knows me from when I was 15 years old and I was, some little schmuck in high school or whatever it was. And, he said that I did this one time and like that behavior never manifested itself or repeated itself again. But like all of a sudden that sticks with me now forever. And especially when you're dealing with history, you're dealing with someone you're dealing with the human experience, which feels like forever, right? I mean, the amount of time that you're on this world, like, I mean, I'm 30, I feel like I'm 50, 60. And there's just so many moments where like are so disconnected to myself. But if you like pulled up my life objectively, I bet it wouldn't look nearly like what I want it to look like, So
Well, the rise the,
how
the
detailed
rise
can
of
it
the
get?
the rise of the web and digitization
Mm,
have significantly changed how we do history in multiple important ways. You
okay.
know, back when I was doing work in the 1980s, really up through the mid 1990s, to look at old newspapers, you were using microfilm. a microfilm reader, a microfilm.
Mhm.
Now, I don't think anyone under age 35 has ever used microfilm. And we've seen this, and my good friend John Ide has benefited from this tremendously. The digitization of old African American,
Yes.
from 1910 through the 1960s, it allows you to search the content of those newspapers without
Mhm.
to become nauseous watching the microfilm of each page roll by. So,
And who knows what you're missing at a certain point
oh
with
yeah, and
speed
and
too.
and so now with digitization, you know, John and others have found all sorts of things. You know, King writing things as a teenager for the Atlanta
Yeah.
newspaper. We found a whole lot more about the efforts of the lady who really got the Montgomery bus boycott started, Joanne Gibson Robinson. Mrs. Robinson was doing all sorts of other stuff in Montgomery before the boycott, and that was in really obscure black newspapers elsewhere in Alabama. But as I touched on earlier, the web is not perfect. There are errors out there. I remember even doing when I was doing my Obama book, the research from my Obama book, roughly, 10, 12 years ago now, coming across, in some web database, an op-ed from the black newspaper in Chicago where Barack was listed as the author. No, it was not by Barack. Now that wasn't a terribly dangerous error, but again, it's
Wait, so
going to
who was
be.
the author?
I'm
So if
sorry.
it wasn't, why would the author write it in Obama's name if it wasn't him?
It was some data entry error.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, that was my impression of it,
Hmm.
that, whoever was filling out the form as they were, indexing these things, something like that.
Cool. Gotcha. I want to learn a little bit of history from you and maybe for the audience as well. And I want to touch on Martin Luther King Jr. I want to talk about his life and what's been interesting, right? I'm doing a little bit of homework before we do this, and I see that you wrote a book called about Martin Luther King Jr. and the FBI in 1981. And I'm sure that in the years since then, you could probably write several more books as to the new information that probably has come out. And I don't know if you've gone through the recent tranche that has come out from the Trump administration, I believe, with that came out in time with the JFK with some of the JFK files or documentation rather. Um, I would love to start from maybe the context of the '60s and what allowed Martin Luther King to emerge as the character that he did and, like, what the country and world was like at that point, and then what people's initial impression and what America's impression of him at the time in particular was. Was he always this kind of revered figure or so maybe to begin with, what was the context and how'd he how'd he rise up?
Well, yeah, we got to break this into several parts. King was a very reluctant, ambivalent public figure. He got drafted into being the spokesperson for the Montgomery bus boycott by his colleagues there in Montgomery in the black community.
I'm sorry, can you what was that? What was the Montgomery bus protest?
The Montgomery boycott was what first made King a public figure. Prior to that, he's this, not yet 30 years old church pastor. He's brand new to Montgomery. It's because he's new to town that older folks in the black community chose him because he wasn't part of that faction or this faction. And King was very burdened by being the subject of public attention. And not just in Montgomery, but continuing forward up through 1963, 1964, King is always being sort of pushed forward by others and is elevated by the news media as this symbol of rising black protest in the South. And King is privately very, frankly, unhappy at the wider world thinking that he is in charge of all this. He's acutely aware uh, that he's just sort of on the cusp of a tide that is, carrying him along, pushing him forward. I mean, he
Mhm.
talked about that very strongly in his Nobel Peace Prize lecture in 1964. And King, frankly, comes to feel trapped in this public leadership role. He had initially hoped that at some point he could go back to being primarily a pastor and perhaps doing some college teaching. And so King develops very strongly during those years a self sacrificial understanding of his own role, an understanding that is very explicitly grounded in his deep Christian faith. Folks have to realize that King was first and foremost a pastor, a preacher. His sermons, especially those at his home church in Atlanta when he moved back to Atlanta in 1960, those are by far more personal and more revealing of
Mm.
his public political civil rights speeches. It's one of the great ironies of the FBI's pursuit of him from 1962 onward that when they start wiretapping his advisors and then King, that the King we see in those intercepted phone calls is very self-critical, not egomaniacal in the slightest. He's named Man of the Year by Time Magazine, and he basically just shrugs it off. So there was a profound humility to King that is rare to the point of being almost unique among public figures. We look at a Barack Obama, we look at a Jesse Jackson, and I'm not restricting it to African Americans at all. We look at anybody who's running for the presidency, running for public office. These are people with an egotistical desire to put themselves forward, to
Right.
be the public eye. King was the opposite. And that's what
Mhm.
makes him such a tremendously grounded, morally grounded figure. Now,
Yeah.
the whole FBI piece of this is sad in multiple ways.
Wait, but
Um,
why would the FBI even begin wiretapping him? I mean, you'd imagine
that's
this guy's an
where I was
American
just about.
force of
That's where I
good.
was just about to go.
Right.
Um, from Montgomery in 1956 until early 1962, the FBI is really not paying much attention to him at all. But then in early 1962, the FBI's two most important human informants ever, supposed American communists who were actually working for the FBI, but who were the American Communist Party's couriers to Moscow,
Wow.
Soviet Union.
Wow.
Those two brothers, Jack and Morris Childs, they tell the FBI that they've learned from their friend Gus Hall, the head of American Communists, that their old buddy Stanley Levison, a businessman in New York, is now King's most influential advisor. Now, that's true. Levison, who first met King in late 1956, Levison very quickly becomes King's best friend. Now,
Mhm.
prior to meeting King, up through 1954-55, Levison had, like the Childs brothers, been involved in handling this secret financial link between the Soviet Union and American communists. Levison would sometimes later tell people, "Oh, I was never a member of the Communist Party." Well, that's sort of not the point. As a teenager growing up in Far Rockaway out in Brooklyn, Levison happened to be a neighbor and Stanley's twin brother Roy. They were good friends with a fellow named William Weiner, who ends up as the communists' financial chief by the 1940s. And so it's that personal connection going way back in life that brings Levison throughout the 40s up through Weiner dies in 54, puts him in this position of being deeply, deeply involved in the Soviet financial connection.
Right.
And the FBI had been following Levison, literally, physically following him a lot, 52, 53, 54, until Levison sort of drops out of the whole thing after his old friend, the treasurer, passes away and the
Mhm.
document passed on. So something like, 6 years go by before the FBI realizes that this one time former important communist functionary is now King's most influential advisor. So they start tapping Levison again. Now, listening in on Levison, they don't hear any evidence at all that he's like functioning as a Soviet agent in manipulating King. I mean,
Mhm.
far. I mean, Levison still has some residual communist friendships. He had invested money for the Communist Party, and that's still sort of generating continuing income that's going to the party. So there are still some ties, but he's in no way representing communism in his relationship with King. Now, the FBI can't quite bring itself to believe that Levison is no longer worth paying attention to. And they tell Robert Kennedy, the attorney general, and his brother, president, this is 62, 63, that this Levison fellow has this horrible background and is now extremely influential with King. So the Kennedys' aides start warning King about Levison. Now, King blows this off. I mean, King knows Levison very well. The Justice Department and White House people aren't allowed to know what the FBI's sources are on Levison because the FBI prizes Jack and Morris so highly. So across 1962 and 1963, the Kennedys get more concerned. King's telling them, this is all crap. King says, okay, I'll stop talking to him. And so instead, King and Levison start both talking to a young black lawyer, Clarence Jones. This doesn't fake out the FBI. They start tapping Jones.
Right.
Uh, so the Kennedys, by the fall of 1963, become convinced that King is lying to them. I'm not, he actually is in contact with them. More importantly, when King stays at Clarence Jones's home in Riverdale up in the Bronx,
Mhm.
just for the March on Washington in August of 1963, through the tap on Jones's phone, the FBI learned that King is carrying on all these multiple extramarital relationships with various women, talking with like 3 or 4 different girlfriends on the same afternoon. Now, it's that I Have a Dream speech a few weeks later that really, vaults King into a sort of international pantheon. And now the FBI is in a position to realize that this sort of, supposed great moral figure is actually, in terms of his private sexual affairs, doing all sorts of naughty things. That then motivates the FBI, who are playing a manipulative game with the Kennedy brothers. The FBI starts asking the Kennedys for permission to tap King himself because of communist influence. But privately, the FBI is not doesn't want to wiretap King himself because of Levison. They've already got Levison tapped. They want to have electronic surveillance on King to capture all of this embarrassing sexual material.
So
And
blackmail.
so they start wiretapping King, and then they extend that to microphone surveillances in King's hotel room, where, with the connivance of hotel managers, they're putting microphone bugs in like lamp fixtures next to the bed.
Right.
Uh, and so, beginning in very early 1964, they acquire these recordings of King and his male friends having all sorts of sexual relations with multiple women. King also, by that point, has a sort of binge drinking problem that's not publicly known. King also, this has not yet fully come out. uh, King in private had a hilariously off color sense of humor, not particularly unusual for a black pastor, in my experience. But the hotel microphone bugs pick up King making a very unpleasant, extended, dirty joke about John F. Kennedy, or
Oh, no.
the corpse of John F. Kennedy. And this is about 4 or 5 weeks after President Kennedy's assassination. So, what does the FBI do with this? They immediately transcribe it and give it to RFK, the president's brother, who's still Attorney General,
Oh,
who
man.
shares it with Jacqueline, the president's widow. This then, uh, by word of mouth, this sort of spreads across, a lot of the government and friends of the government in Washington. Journalism in the 1960s never reported on people's private lives. So this never goes public. But it's really poisonous at a sort of elite level where more and more people, and the FBI is trying to spread the word as best it can. So all throughout 1964, 65, King is living in this very troubled private reality where he knows that the FBI is doing all this nasty stuff behind the scenes, that people are learning about this, but it's never part of the public record. And it's very psychologically stressful for King. One of my good King Scholar colleagues, Nasir Ghaemi, Ghami. Nasir is a psychiatry professor at Tufts Harvard Medical Center. Nasir very, very persuasively has written for several years now that King was basically manic depressive. King had a very high energy level, but every year or so he'd be hospitalized for exhaustion. Now,
Yeah.
King led a phenomenally exhausting life, but when you've got the FBI, sending out reams of information about your relations with, you know, several dozen women, of course, that's going to be very psychologically, you know, troubling for you. So I learned some of that back in 1980, 81, and when I was doing that 1981 book.
How'd you
I
learn it at the time? Was all this information public already?
no, I started doing freedom of information requests to the bureau in late 1978, 79.
Okay.
Um, FOIA processing back at that time was vastly better, vastly
Oh,
easier
yeah?
than the case now. I actually knew personally both of the FBI analysts who were processing the King file, a guy named Kurt
Ho
Cromer,
how'd that happen?
and the guy processing the SCLC, King's organization, the other main file, a guy named Bill Smith. I actually, sometime in sort of in late 1980, I actually drove into the Hoover building. The FBI headquarters has a below ground
Whoa.
drive-through. Drove my little gray Toyota Corolla in there for them to load boxes into the back of it. But the FBI's Foreign Counterintelligence Unit was deeply worried once they realized that I'd learned the identities of Jack and Maura's child, the two, informants who gotten the whole thing against Leveson started. And they very much wanted me to forget what I had learned. And I, you know, brushed them off. That's a long story.
That's very courageous of you.
No, and I sometime in 1980, 81, I interviewed for, I think, 5 Justice Department Civil Rights Division attorneys who'd been tasked with reviewing all of the FBI materials and who would actually listen to the surviving tape recordings from
Mhm.
the phone bug. So I knew what those lawyers remembered, from their review of everything. And that, I mean, I didn't record those gentlemen, and they're not footnoted in the book because the bureau was very focused on figuring out who would told me. And I interviewed, most of the people, FBI agents, FBI supervisors who worked on the King case. I can remember meeting both of the Atlanta agents who did most of the work on it. I can remember where I met the head of the New York field office bag squad, as they called it, bag.
I'm here. Whoa.
Okay.
What happened there?
Yeah, I lost your video.
Yeah, hang on. I think my daughter did something for my other device in the other room. I
Oh,
apologize. Go
you're
ahead, I'm
back
sorry.
now. Okay. No, I mean, pick up where I was. Within the FBI, a bad job was what you called an illegal break-in. Because the bureau the bureau would do illegal break-ins, particularly at Communist Party headquarters, and foreign embassy. They'd break in, and back then, they carried little cameras. They take pictures of documents, and so, the bureau had as good a record of who were members of the Communist Party as the Communist Party did, because they'd
Right.
be there at 3 a.m. And even in the FBI's internal record, that sort of stuff is masked. MASK masked. It's identified as a source who cannot be recontacted is the phrase. And they
That's
had,
convenient.
yeah, they had a whole way, even within the FBI, documents relating to electronic surveillances were restricted. They had a code name at the top of it, June mail, long story. And they were kept in special file rooms so that your average file clerk couldn't sit around and, read up on wiretap transcripts. I mean, in some respects, the FBI was very good at what it did. But when it wanted to completely go after someone, whether it's Dr. King, whether it's organized crime figures, whether it's communists, when you put a wiretap on someone, you learn everything about their lives
Yeah,
uh,
sure.
back in that time. And, I
But
did,
it's a great response to my earlier question, right? About
yeah,
like how well can you possibly know someone? Well, if you're wiretapping them your whole freaking life, then pretty
yeah.
freaking well, right?
No, and I just, the two King advisors who were wiretapped the most, Stan Levis and Clarence Jones, also Bayard Rustin, great man, died in 1987. Wiretaps pick up everything. And they're, with people who aren't Dr. King, I sometimes, avoid going into, things that aren't necessarily relevant. But it's a really ubiquitous thing, and same thing we now see when, we see some story about, someone's email getting hacked. The technology has radically changed across 60 plus years, but in some respects, the underlying problem is just the same old one in a much newer.
Yeah. Yeah. I've talked to a bunch of people on this show, whether they're marketing professors or cybersecurity, financial criminal investigators, stuff like that. They're like, listen, the means in which these things are happening are changing all the time, but the game is always the same, and like there's not much that really changes. It's mostly intel, it's mostly information, and that's what's valuable. And you want to say that data is a currency now that our phones listening, watching, or all our how long we're on a post or how long we're looking at something, what links we click, all that is data points, and, like,
Oh
you
yeah,
can do it like never before, but it's the same thing that anyone wanted to do by sitting outside your house and watching you all night, I mean, it's
yeah,
the same thing, just in a better way.
yeah. Two final things to wrap up the FBI piece of this. Back in 2019, 7 years ago, I published a long update article about all the FBI problems after that big National Archives data dump that you referred to earlier, under the Kennedy Assassination Records Act, because the congressional committees that looked into the Kennedy assassination also looked into the King assassination and swept up all of the FBI King records. Um,
Ah, that's
that was what was in the 2018 huge document dump. So I went through all of that. It's there on the web. To look through all of that, you need to have some fairly good understanding of both FBI and CIA file serialization practices, the numbering. Now,
Oh, how does that work?
if there's such thing as a photographic memory, I certainly have it for documents. So you have to recognize file numbers. I mean, like, you know, King's FBI main FBI file was 100-001. 106670. The main file on his organization, all the people around him, SCLC 100 438 794. And you have to understand the prefixes for both FBI and CIA document serialization to understand which PDFs on these NARA Excel-like spreadsheets do you need to click on. And there's
Mhm.
all the stuff there. It took me weeks to go through this, and I'm pretty good at it. Now, so that article is on my webpage, 2019. There remains under court seal, dating back to 1977, all of the transcripts and surviving recordings from the hotel microphone bug, the target,
Mm.
and the taps on King's phones in Atlanta. That
Mhm.
was taken away from the FBI in 1977, put in the archives for 50 years under seal. That
How does it get
seal
taken away from the FBI?
by court order.
Okay. And what would and who would be responsible for bringing the FBI to court about that? Is that Congress?
It
What is
was
that?
done in the name of King's traveling companion, Bernard Lee, called Lee versus Kelly. Bernard died in 1990. I knew Bernard quite well, knew one of his daughters very well. Now, that seal, 50-year seal, then expires this coming January. And the case was revived by the Trump administration 15, 16 months ago because the Trump administration wanted to unseal it sooner than the 50 years. U.S. District Court in D.C., who's got the case, Richard Leon, he said, no, we're going to stick with 50 years. So it's virtually certain that all of that material will, including like the really unpleasant King joke about John F. Kennedy, that will become public, you
Oh,
know,
man.
6, 7 months from now.
When something becomes publicized like that or, I guess, unsealed, could anyone go through and still redact things? Or once it's unsealed, it's open and it's open?
Virtually everyone who appears in those recordings is now deceased. King's aide and friend Andy Young is still alive, but Andy was not someone who participated in the unpleasant hijinks.
Right.
Judge Leon could encourage the National Archives, I think, to do some redactions, though I everything that's happened in this case gives me the impression that the judge doesn't want to end up having to micromanage this at all. And it's really going to be up to, the Trump White House to tell the National Archives what to do because the archives is part of the executive branch. I mean, they're
Yeah.
not an independent agency. Now, I have interview cassettes dating back to, 1980, which are still perfectly fine. People, can listen to them today. They haven't turned to confetti. Now, I presume that the FBI's old reel to reel recordings from 1964 probably also, will be playable. Certainly
Mhm.
the transcripts are going to be. So whenever the archives releases this on the web or however, this is going to be not just major news, but is going to lead to a really unpleasant, intensely unpleasant debate about reevaluating King
Oh, man.
because of all of this. Even after dealing with this for decades, I've never figured out a fully comfortable way to talk about
Mhm.
how the most unpleasant of his behavior always was when he was really drunk, because it sounds like you're on the verge of making an excuse for saying, oh, he's not responsible for his behavior when he's drunk. Now, that doesn't wash, and we all know that. But there's no getting around the fact that the alcohol problem was a significant contributor.
Yeah, certainly, certainly. And, it doesn't have to be an excuse in as much as it could be a partial explanation, which,
Yeah.
I think that excuse means, "Hey, please try and, look past this." Whereas you say, "Hey, a sober-minded individual wouldn't behave this way, but someone inebriated would be more inclined to lower their guard, which I think everyone knows. And
No,
you
and
know,
King, I always wanna strongly, strongly stress that King himself was intensely aware of his shortcomings, of his failings, and he would talk about this in his sermons at Ebenezer, his church in Atlanta. There's one, and I quote this in my 2019 article, where he says, "There's some Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in all of us." So King was not blasé about this at all.
yeah.
King intensely was aware of his own imperfections and shortcomings.
Yeah. I have a couple of follow-up thoughts or questions on this. By the way, thank you so much because this has been really, really wonderful, and I'm I'm learning a ton. I really appreciate this. Thank you. First of all, I guess the first question that jumps to my mind is, were you ever concerned yourself about poking the bear with the FBI doing this research? And the fact that, listen, if they were they have an unpleasant experience with you or association with you, that's something that you don't necessarily want. Certainly
I
when they
I,
try to
uh,
do it.
they, the unit chief, the foreign counterintelligence unit chief who was tasked with dealing with me, Michael Steinbeck. No, I mean, they offered me a meeting with President Carter, this fall of 1980, and
Wow.
again in early 1981, they offered me a meeting with President Reagan.
Did you
All
take it?
No, 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 no. They wanted me to forget that I knew that Jack Childs had died in August of 1980, just after I learned their identities.
Uh-huh.
But Morris was still living not far from where you are now, I believe Miami Beach. Morris was still active. I mean, the communists and the Soviets did not know in 1980 that he'd been an American agent for close to 30 years. And so when the Bureau realized I was going to go ahead and publish the book, they
Mm.
the whole thing down and put Morris and his wife in witness protection.
Whoa.
So no,
Crazy.
the fact that I was an academic, at that point I was teaching at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. If I had not been an academic, I think they would have been more aggressive with me. Uh,
Yeah.
I was, 27 years old when this started. No, I came through that fine, but you
You
it
have to
it
weather the
was
storm?
it was very good. It was very good training for dealing with Barack Obama in 2016.
I see.
I've always been very aware of that.
Okay, that's certainly you gave me their excuse why they did, as in, and at the time, anyone that was friends of a friend of a friend of a communist could, risk something like this happening. But, B, you said to get blackmail. But do they wanna bring him down for any like, do they have a reason to try to rip him down? And if so, what would that be? Like, I would
No,
imagine he's a force for
yeah.
good, no?
Oh, very, very good to focus on that angle. The Bureau was very hostile towards King, A, because they believed he was under left wing influence, and B, because of his private behavior. But this is really important to emphasize, both Hoover personally and the FBI institutionally was not simply quote unquote racist. They had black people, civil rights black people, whom they had good relationships with. Thurgood Marshall, when he's at the NAACP before he becomes a Supreme Court justice. Roy
Mhm,
Wilkins, head of the NAACP.
mhm,
James Farmer, head of CORE, another major civil rights group. Um, the FBI wanted to promote safe black leaders, moderate black leaders. They didn't want radical leaders. They thought of King as radical. Um, so, and indeed, Hoover himself had a longtime friendship with a minister in Chicago, Archibald Carey, who was a longtime friend of the King family. And Hoover also had a very close relationship with a very prominent black pastor in Baltimore. I believe the first black church figure to have a national TV show. And my King colleague, Lerone Martin, has written about this. And indeed, the Baltimore Black Church Group picketed Dr. King in 1965 when King's SCLC had their annual meeting in Baltimore. So the reality of the FBI was much more sophisticated than the simple Hoover was this racist, gay crossdresser type stuff.
Right. Right, right. So it wasn't necessarily, having a problem with the black civil rights leader, it was more they felt like he wasn't as stable as what they would have probably preferred, particularly with his private behavior.
Yeah, and I mean ideology for them was much more important than race, and then especially after Lyndon Johnson becomes president, Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover had been close friends going back a quarter century before Johnson ends up as president. And Johnson has a voyeuristic interest in the King material that, for example, Robert F. Kennedy certainly did not. And so the amount of anti King interaction between the FBI and the White House goes up dramatically during the Johnson presidency, and especially once starts attacking the war in Vietnam.
Don't want
That
that.
a lot of people, including major black public figures, once very prominent black journalist named Carl Rowan, had friends in government, had friends in the FBI. Rowan published an attack on King about King's Vietnam position in 1967, asserting very strongly that, King was attacking our involvement in Vietnam because he was under communist influence. This
Right.
from a generally liberal black column. And so King, certainly by 1967, 68, King is almost universally seen as significantly more radical than he had been back in 1963.
Mhm. Right, right, right. And to shift gears a little bit, you mentioned earlier briefly, but you mentioned in passing that the FBI was kind of trying to mess around with JFK at a certain point. What why would they I mean, typically speaking, I imagine, right? Typically the way it works that the president selects the head of the FBI and, and the director and I imagine that they'd typically be inclined to be on the same page as one another. Kash Patel, I'm sure, is in line with Trump, and the previous director, I'm sure, was in line with Biden, and so on. Why would the FBI be trying to mess around with JFK at this point in time?
Certainly by the 1960s, indeed even by the late 1940s, Hoover had such a powerful reputation and national presence that he was untouchable. Now, Hoover had good relationships with some attorneys general, some presidents. Franklin Roosevelt in the late 1930s, who empowered Hoover. Everyone correctly remembers FDR as a liberal Democrat, but it's FDR who made J. Edgar Hoover J. Edgar Hoover.
Right.
Uh, Harry Truman was very wary about Hoover. Dwight Eisenhower was not close, though his Attorney General, Herbert Brownell in particular, empowered Hoover. John F. Kennedy kept Hoover at arm's length. Uh, Hoover did not like RFK one bit. And so after John Kennedy's assassination, it's a sort of godsend for Hoover that his old friend Lyndon Johnson is now the president.
Yeah, convenient.
Johnson is perfectly happy to use the FBI as his own, personal surveillance force.
Mhm.
Everyone remembers, Richard Nixon and Watergate, but the reason Watergate happened is that Hoover refused to allow his FBI to do some of the Nixon White House's partisan dirty work. Hoover was
Mm.
trying to protect the FBI from being misused by Nixon. Hoover was an
Wow.
institutionalist. Hoover, the FBI was his creation,
Yeah.
and, he wanted to protect it from political manipulation.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it sounds like the way you're describing it, he knew exactly how to play the game because it's not only that it's not that he had to win every president's favor. You had just you have to just know the right people at that point.
And we should add too, Hoover had extremely close, friendly relationships with many members of Congress, conservatives. I mean, both Republicans and Democrats. And it was thought all across DC, certainly on Capitol Hill, you
Yeah.
know, that Hoover's FBI did have a lot of collected personal dirt about all
Mhm.
sorts of people.
Yeah.
Uh, and Capitol Hill in those years, I worked in the U.S. Senate in 1972, and I personally witnessed a U.S. senator. He was on our same hallway, who was so drunk at about 11 o'clock in the morning that he was talking to a marble pillar. I mentioned this story to Brian Lamb of C-SPAN 3 or 4 months ago, and Brian laughed and said, "Oh, I saw that senator too." Brian's older. No, and we touched much earlier upon, news media in those days didn't report things like that. They would say there was an even more prominent senator who turned up on the Senate floor drunk, Russell Long of Louisiana. And they would, so you could see a newspaper story would say something like Senator Long was in high spirits.
Right. Very
Powerful member of the House from Arkansas, Wilbur Mills, chairman of Ways and Means. Mills ended up in the reflecting pool with a tease dancer from some club on 14th Street. And that became news. That sort of broke the silence. Um, but the news media that everyone's grown up with the last, you know, 25,
yeah.
30, since, starting with Bill Clinton, let's say, this is from Bill Clinton to Donald Trump. It's a completely different world than what happened, and how things happened from FDR to LBJ.
Do you know of a gentleman named Mark Elliott? Do you know who he is? He's a
Mark
writer,
Elliott, no.
yeah, he's a biographer. He wrote this excellent biography on Walt Disney, uh, and he said Disney offered to open their archives to him as long as they gave them, creative control, essentially. And he said, "Thank you so much. Take your offer and shove it up your butt." And made his own and made his own biography, which is awesome, by the way. I read it. It's really phenomenal. But one thing that he and I said when we were talking was, he said, politics is basically Hollywood for ugly people, and and especially when the news and the media gets involved in people's personal lives like this, there's been nothing that hasn't been off limits. And one thing that my mother laments very often, and she's pretty old school, is heartbroken that we don't have any kind of real respect for the position anymore. Forget about the characters, like the position of president and vice president. There's certain things that you say or don't say. And, this even goes back to
Oh,
King.
I'm totally with her.
Yeah, you think so? So
Yeah,
wait,
but
so
I'm
so so so
73.
so what do you think of so how does all this stuff about King, for example, does that affect your perception of him in your eyes? Like when you hear this stuff, when you read these transcripts, do you feel like, hey, this is just his private life and I shouldn't be here right now and like I should really focus on what's important and what he did? Or do you think that this is just too overwhelming to not have an impact on the man?
I don't perceive the existence of choice for me. You know, Documents that survive are documents, especially documents that the National Archives up on the web. The National Archives ain't, fraudulating things, to use a
Yeah.
creative. Now, I mean, as I touched upon earlier, with FBI files, when you're dealing with informant reports, there are things in there that are quite unreliable. There are multiple FBI documents from the mid 60s where they assert that King declared in private, quote, "I am a Marxist." Wrong. What the FBI's actually got is a report from Jack Childs, one of the two crucial informants. Jack tells his agent that a fellow communist operative named Lem Harris, who talked to Levison, that Harris had told Gus Hall, who had told Jack that Levison had said King was a Marxist. So this is like fit and
Yeah.
the FBI wants to believe this.
Right.
And so what Levison told Harris, told Hall, told Jack Childs, told his agent becomes, a phrase in quotation marks attributed to King. That's
Mhm.
the reality of human influence.
Right. Right, right. When you, when you hear, and the way that you're describing Hoover's perception of what the FBI should be, A, that it's his baby, B, it's this agency that should not be politically partisan one way or the other, right? I think that lamentations that most presidents or administrations in power have about the FBI is that they have this quote unquote deep state, and the truth is that a lot of the decisions, are not generally, or a lot of what happens aren't made on the top level or the top tier level, but probably 3 or 4 levels down, and these people could be career people there. They're lasting longer than any 8-year term that any president might have. So, do you think that he did a good job setting that up? Do you think that do you think that what people call the deep state is actually J. Edgar Hoover's vision of the FBI, of what the FBI should be actually being manifested?
No, as I touched upon earlier, I mean, certainly with Richard Nixon, Hoover resisted and successfully resisted being turned into a partisan warrior. I mean, and that's why Nixon ended up, you know, H.R.
Right.
Hall, Nixon.
So the FBI exists for
Who are
itself.
these amateurs who bungled the break in? You know, if FBI agents had been sent to the Democratic National Committee office at the Watergate, they would have pulled it off perfectly, and no one would have noticed.
Mhm.
Instead, the Nixon White House, rebuffed by the FBI, hires these amateurs who get caught
Mhm.
by, the nighttime security guard. I was, this is summer 1972. I was living about 5 blocks from the scene of that at GW University. No, I mean, I think Cash Patel has been an absolute disaster for the
Yeah.
FBI. Uh,
It's pretty crazy.
the bureau, the post Hoover bureau purged much of the bad from the Hoover years, and generally I think the FBI from the late 1970s up through the Obama presidency operated with real integrity most of the time.
Who was the head
I
of the Obama FBI? Is that Ray?
Part of a large chunk of it was Bob Mueller, before he gets into that. I mean, I'm not gonna be able to recite the years year by year by year.
No
I might
problem.
get it wrong. No, but I'm the outflow of people, from the bureau this past year and a half has been troubling even to me. But I mean, I'm not someone who would defend James Comey. I'm certainly not someone who would defend John Brennan, from the eight.
Mhm.
I think Comey made some horribly serious mistakes, and the people that were pursuing Trump, especially that couple who were having an affair during the whole thing. I'm not going to get their names exactly right off the top of my head.
Okay, 'cause I know who they are, yeah.
Yeah, there was some bad behavior there, real bad
Right, right. I see. And so, you mentioned earlier that your some of your experience from I guess the late '60s, early '70s prepared you for your Obama book. What what was the pushback there, if you don't mind, elaborating?
once Barack realized that I had spoken at length, uh, with all three of his former girlfriends, before Michelle, Alex, Genevieve, and Sheila, he was very energetically concerned about what they had told me and what I was going to do with this. So they did outreach to me, and I had my first meeting with Barack in the Oval Office in, the spring of 2016. Hey,
Whoa.
just the two of us there, and we're sitting there discussing the president's, premarital sex life.
Oh my goodness. What was that like?
Let me
You were
let me,
astute? What did you do?
whether it's the FBI in 1980, 81, or a president in 2016, I'm not someone who's going to be bullied.
Man.
And so I made the decision to let Barack read my most, not all, of my book manuscript. in TypeScript. Bob Bauer, who's the White House counsel with the intermediary,
Mhm.
our utterly, utterly impressive professional, superb person. I don't agree with Bob on everything, but his behavior when he was my intermediary with Barack is 1,000.
Awesome.
So
Awesome.
Barack read through, they got the TypeScript to Barack, and Barack read through it and marked it up. And we had 2 long days, afternoons, in the president's dining room, the little windowless room just west of the Oval, past the Lewinsky room, where we sat there, and Barack would page through. I'm sitting to his right, he's on my left. He'd page through and when he came upon something that, he marked up, he'd say to me, "Oh," this is my favorite example. He said, "When I was in second grade in Jakarta, I was fluent in Indonesian because I quoted various people who knew him as a kid saying he could barely speak Indonesian." So, the things that he was objecting to weren't necessarily consequential to me or anyone else.
Right.
You know, people, Barack's an extreme case of this, but it's a general principle that widely applies. You know, people have their own stories and they want to stick to their stories. They're not very eager to have some outside, very thorough critical eye,
Oh,
uh,
yes.
look at. I got started on the Obama book because when he first emerged as a significant figure in uh, uh, I read Dreams from My Father, his memoir, and I realized that this was there were all these made up characters. I was very interested in, okay, who were the real people? What really happened? How much of this is true? How much of it's completely imaginary? So that was my initial focus, was the 3 years that he worked as a community organizer on the far south side of Chicago, 1985 to 88. That's what drew
Mhm.
me to all this. And as I wrote about later, Dreams from My Father is historical fiction. It's not a work of nonfiction. Period. Now, Barack, of course, does not like that, but it, it's not accidental that the Obama Presidential Center does not have an archive, because
Right.
if it had a presidential archive, that would encourage researchers to come
Wow,
critic
I didn't even know
the
wow, that's
presidency.
pretty crazy. Yeah.
No. So I mean, no one, I'm certain, no one is less surprised than Dave Garrow that Barack does not want to encourage archival research into his presidency.
Man. So, I ge can I ask on a human level, when you're experiencing all these meetings, right? And, like, listen, this is a big deal. I get nervous before interviews, when I'm sitting in a Skype and a Zoom call like this, and, I don't wanna mess things up. What's going are you going like, "Listen, I just have a job to do," or I know what this I have this narrative and I wanna set the record straight." Like, how do you go into this? How do you prepare yourself for it? Like, what
I'm not
what's your what do you think?
I'm not nervous. No, I'm not nervous about any of it. I started interviewing people well, actually, first interview I ever did, Judge Frank Johnson, Alabama. That was May of '76. So I've been doing this over 50 years now. No, I mean, I was a almost charter member of Democratic Socialists of America when it was first formed in 1983. Now, DSA then and DSA now have no relationship to each other except the name.
Can
I
you
don't
elaborate on the differences?
Well, we were not an anti-Semitic hate group in 1983.
Okay.
Michael Harrington, wonderful man, founded DSA. A lot of DSA in that time was Jewish. Irving
Mhm.
Howe, very well-known author, editor, Bogdan
What was the
Denich.
philosophy? What was the political philosophy at the time?
Early Bernie Sanders,
Gotcha.
but much more. I mean, at that time we don't have the time here today to do this, and I'm really rusty. But both Mike Harrington and Bayard Rustin, whom I mentioned earlier, and my late friend Jim Cohn, the founder of Black Liberation Theology, they all had major effects on me, 83 through 87. And really, just like Dr. King himself, King king dealt with every human being as an equal, whether it's
Mhm.
somebody on the on the sidewalk on out Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, or it's John F. Kennedy or Lyndon Johnson. So
Mhm.
that, and I attribute this in need of to Mike and Byard and Jim. That's always been my attitude. I mean, whether it's a bus driver here in Pittsburgh or Barack Obama in the Oval Office, all people
You
are
look at them like people.
all people are equal.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I end up walking away with a lot of my by the way, all the interviews I end up nervous, for, I end up walking away like, no, they're just a person. Like, they're just a person that has yeah, they just did things, and so the things may have been more impressive, but they're human beings like anyone else, and,
Yeah,
I thought that was and so I admire that. I think that's really, really wonderful, and I think that it's funny because I think a lot of people try to preach this idea. I think it's very difficult to li I think it's relatively difficult to live. I think it's uncomfortable to live because then it really there's I think that especially in today's world, aside from the fact that we're socially isolated, we're very quick to group into theys and us, and then theys are very easily demonized.
yeah,
Whereas you look at someone like you're just a person, and like you like whatever your affiliation,
yeah,
whatever it is, like if you get down to the root of it, you're just a dude, and like
yeah.
let's talk about it. And
Yeah.
it's hard. It's
No, I think that's a sort of good theme, good point for us to wrap up on.
sure, definitely, yeah, David, Mr. Garrow, this was really, really
Oh no,
phenomenal. Thank you so
thank
much.
you. It's been fun to do this.
I appreciate this. Maybe we'll do this again sometime because it sounds like you
Okay,
have a lot more we could talk about. But thank you so
right,
much for the time
right.
today, and it's a real pleasure.
Okay,
Take care.
great.
Bye
Yeah, bye. Be well.
bye.